should Street Fighter 6 have the global parry system that Street Fighter 3 had?
Absolutely not.
When you see intent and then you see it play out and you can appreciate it, that's when the hair on your arm stands up, and that's when you sit on the edge of your seat, and that's when you go, wow. And the parry and third strike sets up for that so brilliantly. And in Street Fighter V, so many instances, so many interactions where, well, did they mean to do it, or were they fishing with crush counters?
It's a big problem with parries. They were not easy to use, but they were fun to use. And it alienated so many gamers out there that if you put in too hardcore of a mechanic as a base level thing, it ruins the game. And I think Third Strike is a really good, or Street Fighter 3 in general, is a really good example of what not to do with a game mechanic.
One of the most revered fighting games of all time is Street Fighter 3. Now, it wasn't commercially successful, as we say every other episode of this podcast, but it is regarded as one of the best fighting games. Why? And what do people mean by that? I think what they mean by that is it is one of the most entertaining and satisfying to play and perhaps watch. It's not balanced. We know for sure it's not very balanced. That's not the point. It's incredibly fun to play and watch, as far as I can tell, and in my experiences as well, which is what propels it to this status. And so if that's the case, then can we capture some of whatever that essence was that made it incredibly fun and satisfying to play and dump that into Street Fighter 6? And what is the component of Street Fighter 3 that is most often brought up? It's the parry system. As far as its gameplay goes, it's the parry system. It's this very broad, generally applied to the entire roster in virtually the same way for every character system. And it's something about that, well, I don't want to get too far ahead of myself. So, should Street Fighter 6, and this is my question to you and to you guys, should Street Fighter 6 have the global parry system that Street Fighter 3 had?
Absolutely
That's my question
not.
to you. All right, that's a good
Absolutely not.
But before we get into why absolutely not, and a little bit more of that, if you would be so kind as to Psycho Crush the like button and subscribe to our channel, and hey, even maybe leave a comment about why Street Fighter 6 should have this parry mechanic or not, because it really helps out our channel and the algorithm, and you guys know all that stuff. But apparently you have to say it every single video because people really won't. So anyways, okay, so I turn this over to you. You don't think we should have global parries as not maybe the mechanic, but a mechanic in Street Fighter 6. Por qué no?
It is basically, it negates fireballs is one of the biggest issues with it. You have to introduce stuff like, Gray Life and other things, and then the timing to pull off parries is too pro level. That was one of the biggest problems with Street Fighter 3 is it was too hard of a game to get into. To get to that Grandmaster chess level of how the game is played, you had to be too good, and so it alienated a lot of casual gamers. And that was the whole point of the focus attack, which was, hey, if you want to parry, you hold two buttons, you do a big wind-up animation, it's easy to use, and it's fun to use. That was a big problem with parries. They were not easy to use, but they were fun to use. And it alienated so many gamers out there that if you put in too hardcore of a mechanic as a base level thing, it ruins the game. And I think Third Strike is a really good, or Street Fighter 3 in general, is a really good example of what not to do with a game mechanic. And there it is.
Well, so with Street Fighter 3, we've talked a lot, as I've just mentioned, about the reasons why it wasn't as successful as it probably should have, or it could have been, commercially speaking. And then at the same time, it's a little bit of a conundrum that in the competitive realm and in the gameplay realm, by those who quote unquote know what they're doing more so, or are more keyed into this, to fighting games in general, they say it's one of the best that's ever been invented. And it's like, well, I have a hard time just throwing that all away in the idea that, when we're here in the process of Capcom developing a brand new game, it's like we should be looking at the example that was quote unquote the best that was ever created, or at least is in that conversation so consistently, to see what we can take out of that. And one of the big things that we've said as far as Street Fighter 3's lack of success was, well, the way it was handled with brand new characters. It wasn't recognizable. And so then that's much, much more on the storefront part of things.
Yeah,
like people
that's
window
true.
shopping. But go ahead, yeah.
But this is something Ono heavily addressed because the Third Strike community back in the day was very up in arms that they removed parries. They're like, parries are the best thing that's ever happened to Street Fighter. What are you doing? This needs to be in there. And Ono's response was, very similar to what I said. And then, that's what born out the focus attack mechanic.
Hmm.
And that is an even more universally beloved mechanic. Even people who don't like Street Fighter 4, I know a number of them, they like that mechanic. They're like, that mechanic was so smart because it addressed all things. You added extra layers of complexity and being able to spend your meter and meter management, all that other kind of stuff. Plus, you did have parries in there in a way that weren't so dominating of the game where they completely negated fireball usage, which is a really important aspect of Street Fighter. When you negate fireballs entirely, it is a horrible design choice in this franchise. Fireballs, projectiles are what this franchise is known for in the fighting game realm, among other things, but it's one of the more prominent features of it. And anything that almost entirely negated it, which was parries, is a bad idea. And then with the focus attack, it didn't entirely negate it. It was still a fairly good factor. And then after you focus absorbed like 2 fireballs, you generally wanted to stop
You
because
didn't want to do any more because you were committed with that gray life, right?
Exactly.
Mm-hmm.
And that made Fireball still useful. You played Goken, Fireball still stayed useful for him. I played Rose. I know they stayed useful for her. And even in Street Fighter 5, I think that Fireballs are worse than they were in 4. And again, reintroducing parries would just, I think, destroy the game. We've been there, we've done that. Let's not do that again.
Well, okay. My main counter to this idea that I have here in my own notes is that yes, first of all, mechanics very heavily can affect the general flow or the atmosphere of a game. They can benefit certain styles, offense or defense more broadly. They can benefit certain kinds of characters and whatnot. And of course, as we saw in Street Fighter 3, they very much took away from the fireball game. They negate projectiles very quickly, very rapidly. And I appreciate what you said there too about Street Fighter 4 because yes, it seems the focus attack was an evolution of the parry in some sense. And so maybe that was already an example of Capcom trying to do what I've just laid out here and capture what was particularly good, or at least one of the big particularly good things about Third Strike, and encompass it into a future title. I don't disagree with that at all, but I also don't think that just having the parry there is a matter of fact negation of fireballs to the extent where you can't have that as a real part of your game. And we've seen the parry mechanic brought back multiple times, not only through the focus attack, if you say that that's like the parry's evolved cousin or something like that, but other characters have had individual parries moving forward. And Goken,
Right.
and maybe there's a discernment we should make about parries and counters, but the style of move where if you attack during this animation, you will be hit because of it, or it won't go well for you because of it. It's like this anti-momentum sort of a thing. And
And the easiest example for most people will probably be reuse parries in Street Fighter 5. He
and
has a
there's
couple
more
of
in
them.
5. Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, and so Gil has it, Ryu has it, and a handful of characters Colleen
Cody.
has it. Yeah,
Yeah.
and so this mechanic has come back, and I would dare not say that it's not parries in Street Fighter 5 that negate fireballs. I mean, they are something to deal with fireballs, but I don't think, widely speaking, when we talk about Street Fighter 5, as one of its issues is that it hasn't let fireball characters really flourish like we kind of expect them to in Street Fighter, save for if they are ridiculously powerful, aka Guile or someone like that, then they might be okay. But you want average fireball throwers to be all right, and that really hasn't been the case in Street Fighter 5. I wouldn't lay that at the feet of some characters have parry or counter mechanics. I think there's a lot of other ways to go around fireballs, and I don't say that to say, well, parries aren't doing that. Of course they're doing that, but as we saw in the Street Fighter 4 example, I think you could tweak things around a good bit and make those parries not, maybe they do absorb a lot more gray life than they did in Street Fighter 3, where there's like no consequence except for you would gain some meter if you absorbed a fireball, right? And the fireball thrower wouldn't want to be just sitting there doing that. That would be bad strategy on their part. But I really do think that you could tweak the parry around. Like maybe you do absorb, or maybe it's only from fireballs that you absorb some gray life, or you generate gray life on your side, I should say, and maybe not so much if you absorb a normal or you parry a normal.
And let me add in here too for Third Strike players, because I know they're all doing the Yun crouching medium punch from full screen, because that would build meter. That's one thing that Capcom learned as well. That was a big factor here, and why fireballs got so negated is for characters like Yun, they would immediately double backdash
Hmm.
and then do the crouching medium punch over and over again because that's building up meter for the Genijin. And so when someone that's a very normal reaction is to toss plasma at someone when they backdash away from you, right? Because like, oh, you're going to give me space, here we go, and then that starts negating it. So that was a Street Fighter 3 really amplified that problem more so than other fighting games we've seen because of choices like making buttons build meter. It was just so advantageous to back off in that game, and it became a huge part of the meta.
Sure, sure. So it couldn't be, I think where we've gotten so far in this is that it couldn't necessarily be exactly like it appeared in Street Fighter 3 because there were clear problems then that we would want to avoid. We already know we don't want to have to deal with right off the bat. I'm not at the point yet where I can say we should throw parries out completely as a global mechanic. But let me back up a little bit and talk more generally about sort of what mechanics are in that when mechanics serve, I think, two major purposes. Not only these two, but these are two big things that when you talk about, especially global mechanics, this is what you're kind of discussing in the Street Fighter franchise. And it's one, that they tend to give games their unique identity. And usually this is one overall mechanic that does this, although every game comes with a handful of different mechanics, some of which have become so commonplace we don't even think of them as mechanics.
Yeah, backdashes are
Backdashes, throw techs.
Super moves are mechanics.
Supers is what I would say that kind of came around in Street Fighter 2, and then they've just been in every Street Fighter game since, as a matter of fact thing, and just about every fighting game. And then was it? I'm showing my lack of knowledge here. Was it in Third Strike or Street Fighter 3 or Street Fighter Alpha that we started having EX moves where you could more nuancedly use your super meter? If you didn't want to hold the whole thing, you could use it on individual moves, and now two people could play Guile completely different because one might be waiting to use the super and strategizing around that, and one might prefer to use a bunch more EX Sonic Booms, for instance. But was it in Alpha or was it in Street Fighter 3?
Darkstalkers, I believe, actually, and then Street Fighter 3.
Okay, so, I was in the Street Fighter, but okay, fair enough. Then there you go.
Yeah,
so
I'm
yes,
pretty
and
sure.
yeah, and it's really cool. Like these mechanics also, as I mentioned earlier, affect the flow and the atmosphere of the gameplay, right? And so when you talk about the global ones, the ones that apply across the board, in Street Fighter V, one of the biggest problems that came from this game that we encountered during this game was how different the global mechanic applied to all the different characters, how important it was, and this is of course the V system. V triggers are probably a disproportionately large part of this, but it's the whole thing. In the V system, everybody has not only different frame data on it, but they're completely different moves and maneuvers, from offense to defensive, from like timers to single use. It was a total rainbow across the board, which that has its advantages, but in the efforts to try to balance and make the game feel fun in a balanced manner, it really hindered Street Fighter V. And if you go back to Street Fighter IV, the global mechanic was the focus attack, and that was used both as the absorption and as the combo extender. It was very versatile and very cool. But even there, everyone had the same general idea, but they didn't have the same frame data. They didn't have the same hit and hurt boxes, and even that small discrepancy across characters was something. If you go to Street Fighter 3, the global parry mechanic can be applied much more consistently to every character, and I'm not certain that there weren't any little nuances, like maybe certain characters in certain moves might recover a frame faster or something like that. I don't know. But as far as I understand it, basically everybody did the same parry. Like if you press forward when the horizontal attack was coming at the right time, you could parry, and then you had a certain advantage. And the same thing if you press down when they're doing a low attack. And I think that this would really help in the avenue of keeping the game feeling balanced on the mechanical level, and this certainly, there's no way that this doesn't come from a Street Fighter V sort of PTSD sort of situation, with V triggers becoming so incredibly important and so like a black hole absorbing so much of the significance of a round, that I'm like, maybe we should err on the side of something that's a little more global and a little more evenly applied to the roster. But what do you think about that?
It's an interesting approach in that that one mechanic has to really flow throughout the game, and you lose the ability to fine tune it by character. And And that's actually what's nice about V triggers is you can fine tune it by the characters. So, for example, I play Rose. I love her tarot cards. I did not think I would like those because they're random, they're RNG and all this other kind of stuff. But they play really super well with the character, and it actually enables me with Rose. Like if people back off of me now, I figured out that I just start pulling out tarot cards and I'm building up a bunch of V gauge. If you give that mechanic to say G or something like that, or someone in the wrong way, it could really be game breaking. But you're able to fine tune it by character and give characters very interesting V skills and V triggers. And I love the system in Street Fighter V. Obviously, my favorite game. And I love the customization per character. The big issues with V triggers have just been they've been too dominant. They've been far too good overall, where the game too often came down to them. I don't think they lack anything for interesting nature. Even someone like Nikali, who we call the most boring, B character of all time, his V skill 1 is very interesting because you see a lot of players back off and immediately try to build that up, and just dealing with that frontline defense of it, knowing that he's building towards this very powerful V trigger. It's such a mental game you're adding into stuff, and I love that they made the character based around that, because I do think it's an interesting move. I just think he has too few of them, kind of thing. And so I actually really like the V skill and V trigger system in Street Fighter V.
It's almost what kind of emerges to me here is that if you have as much versatility and as many moving parts as a system like the V system presents versus the relatively fewer moving parts, and that's not to say that the parry isn't complex or doesn't add a massive level of complexity and engagement for a match, but it's relatively simple and it can be applied more generally across the board than the V system can. It's almost like there's more danger to give that much space of the V system, and there's much more that you have to then sort of balance and make sure that all of these moving parts work in tandem with one another and don't lead to overpowered situations. And this is a lot more to do. It's a lot more chaotic, but at the same time, if you as the developers are able to harness all that and execute it properly and keep everything in the appropriate rhythm and make it all work well with one another, then the ceiling is much higher and the potential is much higher. And it might be like that you're in a place where you're trusting Capcom as a developer with this much power, that much responsibility, that they might do something well with that. And I'm kind of more of this sense of maybe we went a little bit too far into the unknown and into the potential with Street Fighter V, and I'm kind of with this, at least with this segment and this thought process, wanting to sort of reel things back and contain it a little more, because it was a little bit too much chaos last time, and we need a little bit more order, a little bit more control this time around. Is sort of just a reaction I had to when you were talking about that, and it feels like maybe that's sort of the approaches that we're giving it here.
Well, that's a very Street Fighter 4 approach, actually, because everyone had a universal focus attack mechanic, but not everyone's character had as good of one as the other one. For example, Balrog and Rose.
Freaking long, but yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, well, there you go. Balrog and Rose had two of the worst focus attacks in the entire game, but you actually saw someone like PR Balrog start to use his focus attack, which just had horrible range, horrible frame data, but it worked so well with the system that he started blowing up people with shimmies and other stuff that he was playing a very Street Fighter V game in Street Fighter 4. PR Balrog was. But then, as you mentioned, you had someone like Fei Long or Dudley who had some of the best focus attacks in the entire game. Ryu was up there too. And that was a universal mechanic that everyone had function in a similar way, but there were particulars in there that made some characters much better at it than others. I personally was not a big fan of that because, again, I played Rose, and it's like I barely got to use focus pretty much at all because it was just almost a worthless move. It wasn't
yeah,
even
but you
worth
got to
doing.
backdash all damn day. But no, I'm not. That doesn't.
No, that's exactly it. See, that's why I like the V skill system, is because it's rare to have completely worthless V skills. I know there's a few out there. My apologies to the people who play those characters, but for the most part, Capcom did the right thing when they said every move has a purpose in this. They mostly got there, not completely, but they mostly got there.
And of that, I think, and we'll wrap this up pretty soon here, but of that idea that every move has a purpose and you can see that defined purpose, that's getting at what we appreciate most when we watch and when we play fighting games, is that we want to see. It's like these two working brains next to each other with a certain amount of resources each, and they're a little bit different, right? And they're in this real-time problem-solving contest where it's not only do they have to stay ahead of each other, but because there's the execution, they also have to execute, and that's really interesting to us. But when you see intent and then you see it play out and you can appreciate it, that's when the hair on your arm stands up. And that's when you sit on the edge of your seat. And that's when you go, wow. And the parry and third strike sets up for that so brilliantly. Because, yes, there's the occasional, oops, I accidentally pressed forward when I was supposed to be blocking at the right time and I parried. And it's like, well, then did you follow up afterwards? Because probably not. So many times when a parry happens in the third strike sense, you can see intent and you can see the fruits of someone's practice and their labor coming to the foreground. And in Street Fighter V, so many instances, so many interactions where, well, did they mean to do it, or were they fishing with crush counters, or were they fishing because they had a really advantageous situation because they're V triggers? And I don't think, to play devil's advocate, I don't think those situations were there just because of the mechanic that was in place. I think that they were there more specifically because the mechanic that was in place was not handled in enough detail and was not executed well enough to avoid those potholes. But I think, well, okay, so we have a development team that wasn't able to really do it with that much freedom. Again, maybe they should cinch it up a little bit and go with something that doesn't give them as much freedom, that confines them a little bit more, and that shows intent. Because, man, that's something that's really been missing from Street Fighter V, that is hailed and that propels Street Fighter 3 in large part to being one of the most revered fighting games of all time. I just think we could use a little bit of Street Fighter 3 sauce in whatever comes next.